The philosopher we're going to be talking about in this video is one that is considered by many to be a rarity when it comes to philosophers. When looking at other well-known philosophers such as Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, or Pascal, the first thing that comes to mind usually isn't cool or hot. But this dude was a real Chad. He was an existential philosopher, world-renowned writer, and Nobel Prize winner for literature. Although he denied being a philosopher on multiple occasions, he is still considered by many to be among some of the most well-known philosophers. His name was Albert Camus was born on November 7, 1913, raised by his mother Catherine Elaine Sins Camus and his grandmother Madame Sins. Camus was born in a small village called Mondovie in the northeast region of French Algeria. He had one sibling, an older brother named Lucien Camus, after their father, Lucien Auguste Camus. Camus' mother was a housekeeper and a part-time factory worker, and his father was a military veteran and wine-shipping clerk. In 1914, when Camus was just a wee little lad, his father had to head out into the battlefield once again to fight in the First World War. Sadly, on October 11, 1914, Camus' father died due to shrapnel wounds he suffered in the First Battle of the Marne. This is said to have affected Camus' mother greatly, as she spoke little after this event for almost the rest of her life. This is also said to have affected some of Camus' writings. He himself, toward the end of his life, described the ambition to capture in his writings, quote, the admirable silence of a mother and one man's effort to rediscover a justice or a love to match the silence. The only thing Camus learned about his father as a child was that he once became extremely ill after witnessing a public execution, which is said to have influenced his lifelong opposition toward the death penalty. After Camus' father's death, him, his brother, and his mother moved to Algiers, where they lived with his grandmother and maternal uncle Gustave Occult. They stayed in their grandmother's cramped second-floor apartment with 3 rooms, no bathroom, electricity, or running water. Camus' mother, who was partially deaf and illiterate, worked as a housekeeper and ammunition factory worker to try and support the family. In Camus' autobiographical novel published after his death titled The First Man, he recalls this part of his life being mixed with pain and affection. He also speaks of these harsh conditions of poverty being relieved by hunting trips, family outings, childhood games, scenic flashes of the sun, seashore, mountains, and deserts. When Camus started to attend his local elementary school, he encountered his first series of mentors and teachers who recognized his intelligence. These new mentors introduced Camus to a new world of history, imagination, and literary skills that were far beyond the streets of Belcourt and working-class poverty. Although Camus was stigmatized in this society as being a war veteran's child that was dependent on public welfare and constantly hindered by recurring health issues, Camus proved himself to be a notable student. Eventually, he got a scholarship to attend high school at the Grand Lys, which was located near the famous Casbah district. It was here where Camus would recognize the idea of the outsider, since this school brought him closer to the native Muslim community. Camus later mentions the idea of the outsider numerous times in his writings. In secondary school, Camus started to get more into reading and read books of authors such as Gide, Proust, Verlaine, Bergson, and many others. He learned Latin and English and developed many of his lifelong interests in literature, art, theater, and film, as well as gaining an interest in sports, mainly soccer. Football. It was also around this time that Camus suffered his first serious tuberculosis attack, a disease that would affect him from time to time for the rest of his career. When Camus finished his
baccalauréat
in 1932, he was looking forward to a career in journalism, the arts, or higher education. He was even contributing articles to Sud, a literary monthly, before graduating. The next 4 years, from 1933 to 1937, Camus' life would be especially busy. He would be attending college, working at odd jobs, marrying his first wife, Simone Nier, getting divorced, briefly joining the Communist Party, and beginning his theatrical and writing career. Among the various employments he had at this time, one was routine office work where one task consisted of recording and sifting through meteorological data, and another involved paper shuffling into an auto license bureau. It is thought that this experience could have resulted in his famous conception of the Sisyphean struggle and defiance in the face of the absurd. In 1933, Camus also enrolled at the University of Algiers to pursue an education specializing in philosophy and gained certificates in sociology and psychology along the way. In 1936, Camus became a co-founder with a group of peers of that, or also known in English as Labor Theatre. Anyways, this was a professional acting company specializing in drama with left-wing political themes. A drama that was based on a recent strike at the time where miners in, you guessed it, Asturias, Spain were angered by the entry of the Spanish Confederation of the Autonomous Right into the Spanish government during the Spanish Civil War. That same year, Camus earned his degree and finished writing his thesis, a study of the influence of Plotinus and Neoplatonism on the thoughts and writings of St. Augustine. Yeah, I thought it sounded made up at first too. In 1942, Camus returned to France, once again getting a job as a journalist, and he published his first novel, which was met with favorable critical response, which included a lengthy review from Jean-Paul Sartre, which propelled Camus' notability. A year later, he published The Myth of Sisyphus, which was his philosophical anatomy of suicide and the absurd, and he got a job at Gallimard Publishing as an editor, which was a position he would hold until his death. In the fall of 1957, Camus was surprised to hear that he had won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He approached the receival of this award with mixed feelings. He knew that it was obviously a tremendous honor, but on the other hand, he felt that André Malraux, a friend and fellow novelist, was more deserving. He was also aware that the Nobel was often given to artists at the end of a long career. Camus felt like he was still only midway through his literary journey. He even stated this at his acceptance speech. It's quite sad to know at the time Camus could not have known as he spoke these words that most of his writing career would in fact be behind him. On January 4th, 1960, Camus died tragically in a car accident while in the passenger seat of a Facel Vega, being driven by his friend and publisher's nephew, Michel Gallimard, who also suffered fatal injuries. Camus' death was terribly ironic since he is reported to have stated that the most absurd way to die would be in a car accident. Camus was an existential philosopher who dealt mainly with the topic of the meaning of life. Camus was a nihilist, meaning that he believed that there was no meaning to life. Camus saw the universe as cold, unresponsive, and indifferent to whatever we do. This is what led Camus to his nihilistic perspective on life and why most of his philosophies were about how to deal with the cold and unresponsiveness of the universe. When it came to the meaning of life, Camus had a simple answer: there is none. Camus believed that anyone who is a critical thinker, such as a philosopher, would realize that all of the meanings humans had come up with for their lives were just lies. He was explicit in stating that religion and God were not justifiable as the meaning of life, though he also did not accept any other non-theistic perspectives to the meaning of life, such as Sartre's belief that you have to make your own meaning. No, instead, Camus believed that there is no meaning and you can't do anything about it but live your life. He believed that if you were to resort to creating your own meaning, using a god or religion as your meaning, or even using other secular sources such as science, the commodity culture, or entertainment, it would be a sort of moral/intellectual suicide, because you'd be knowingly defying reason and logic and pursuing a fake or pre-made idea just because it gave you a sense of security. Quote, "The only truly serious philosophical problem is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest come afterwards." Camus started his book with a very contentious statement, which is that the most important philosophical question is whether life is meaningless enough to warrant us killing ourselves. We already talked about how Camus believed that there was no meaning to life. After coming to this realization, Camus also realized that if there is no meaning, then maybe we would be tempted to not live. Camus talks about suicide and really considers it as a philosophical answer, but he ends up at the conclusion that suicide is the incorrect answer, because if living has no meaning, then how can death be any more meaningful? So with these two ideas about intellectual suicide and actual suicide, the logical conclusion seems to be that if not one, then the other. If you aren't going to kill yourself, then it would be presumed that you would need a meaning, and if you have no meaning, then it would be presumed that you wouldn't have a need to live. But Camus says neither of these is an option, neither intellectual or physical suicide. So what then? Wouldn't it be absolutely absurd to not do one or the other? This is the conclusion that Camus comes to: absurdity. The absurd hero is the name that Camus gives to the person who is able to look at the contradictory nature of life and continues moving forward. Someone who is happy and living well, but doesn't turn to hopeful yet illogical answers to try and mask the insecurity and unsureness about life. Someone who continues to live life as if there were meaning despite the meaninglessness of life. Someone who, in the eyes of others, would be completely absurd. This book that was previously quoted is seen as the most essential when it comes to Camus' philosophies. He goes in depth about suicide and the absurd as we talked about, using Sisyphus as an example. Sisyphus is a Greek mythological figure who is the king of Corinth. He was seen as a tyrant and a trickster. He was even smart enough to escape death twice by tricking the gods, but his third punishment ended up not being death, but instead an eternal punishment that consisted of rolling a boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll back down again and start over. Camus interprets Sisyphus in his book as defiant. Instead of being hopeless and desperate for something else, Sisyphus embraces his fate, or as Camus put it, quote, "This universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy." Today, Camus is one of the most well-known philosophers around the world. His traits make him distinct from most philosophers in the past, and that is one of the many reasons he is so well known today. Camus is a philosopher that not only shared his ideas with the world, but one that also lived by them. People often take a liking to Camus since his ideas and lifestyle are ones that many people can relate to. For example, as we previously talked about with the myth of Sisyphus. Most people are going through this repetitive lifestyle every day of their lives over and over again. Many people come to hate their jobs, feeling like they're just wasting their lives away. Wake up, eat breakfast, defecate, brush your teeth, take a shower, go to school or your job, come home, clean the toilet, brush your floor, brush your teeth, scroll through your favorite social media for 4 hours, good night. This is just what life is. Just like Sisyphus pushing up a boulder for eternity, our lives are mostly a repetitive cycle. But one thing that Camus realizes, as we said before, is that, quote, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." Meaning that Camus says that you should enjoy and embrace your repetitive life, build better habits, work towards that goal you've always wanted to achieve. And yes, although that may also be repetitive, at least you'll be enjoying it. Thanks for watching.